Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be back with you again, and I'm glad to have back on for another conversation Professor Isa Blumi, who I spoke with, I think it was about 2 weeks ago now, predominantly about Yemen, but about what's happening in the entire region. Isa, welcome back. Thank you again for coming back on to discuss the rapidly escalating situation here in the West Asia region.
For all the wrong reasons, we're back together talking, but
Yeah.
nevertheless, thank you for the opportunity and greetings to your audience.
Thank you. I wanted to kick off with the Trump, in inverted commas, peace plan for Palestine, for Gaza. Israel has already broken the ceasefire, of course, not only in the last 48 hours over this. There's a lot of rumors circulating, but it appears that Hamas has been trying to root out the ISIS or the Takfiri elements in Gaza. Israel has been providing, of course, air cover, just as it did in Syria for Jolani's forces at various points in the history of the regime change war in Syria. But let's start off with all the pomp and circumstance around Trump's peace deal in Sharm el-Sheikh, which honestly I found to be absolutely grotesque, considering how little it was actually offering the Palestinians. It was entirely from a Zionist perspective. So let's start off with, I guess, your overall opinion of why this happened now, number one, and what it is going to be used for. How is it going to be interpreted by the enemies of Palestine in the favor of the enemies of Palestine?
Right. It was theater, very crude. You couldn't get a more kind of pathetic group of secondary players behind this cartoon character. I don't like to refer to Trump as a cartoon character. That's too easy. He is a personality that is clearly being harnessed now to serve certain very adaptive strategies. I think what happened with Sharm el-Sheikh, there may be some symbolic importance of the dating and the location, all that kind of stuff. I will leave that for future analysis. But I mean, we have to acknowledge that there are long-term consequences for Zionists and those who are indirectly linked with the Zionist project, which is, as we've said before, one of many iterations of North Atlantic imperialism, right? I mean, it's a colony state, and much like the colony states elsewhere in the world, it has to endure certain kinds of relationships with the metropole. Obviously, the Zionist state doesn't survive a day without subsidy in one shape or form from the metropole. Most obviously from the United States, but all the kind of auxiliary entities in the region, from Turkey, especially being an important part of that. Obviously, Egypt is a facilitator, the Gulf countries in their own ways.
Jordan.
Certainly Jordan. And I think they all were in the midst of some serious problems with their constituencies. I think this needed to somewhat of a reprieve. This Jared Kushner character, this kind of devilish-looking creature that is affiliated with the family directly by marriage, gave some interviews in the recently purchased CBS network in the U.S. And he tried to play somewhat of an intermediary between the outrage that is clearly manifesting in larger parts of Western societies. Not to the extent that it actually threatens these regimes that run. Wall Street is not threatened by the outrage that people are beginning to feel, but the fact that it has disseminated itself into Christian fundamentalist circles, that it's centered, it's circulated in amongst the kind of populist base that Trump phenomena had, where those who have conscious in the left in Western politics have now shifted into that medium area where it's not neatly defined anymore who is a right-wing, left-wing person. And I think that is a little bit concerning for certain actors. So what my suspicion, why I have the suspicion, is just how much the peace aspect of this intervention was marketed in all media, and that there was an expected response from the audience to be relieved that this is something, it somehow ended something, right?
Yeah.
And you had a full range of auxiliary actors in this, from Pakistani to Saudi to
Oh, the
the
Pakistani prime minister was
yeah.
extraordinary. I mean,
Oh
this
yeah.
was
Well, of course, the European, who also looked quite, I mean, it's quite telling. The body language from Metz, who was completely uh, sidelined in all this, to Meloni kind of being there, put front and center in the back, and him kind of degrading her as just,
yeah,
being this
and
good looking.
Starmer.
Yeah, and Stammer. I mean, that was also, this
That was
is,
total humiliation,
and Macron
actually.
also, who was
Yeah.
manhandled, and I find that there, this is all, of course, orchestrated. This is part of something, and I think we
Mm,
also get distracted when we forget about the other
yeah.
dynamics at play than just this horrible events happening in Gaza or elsewhere, and let alone Sudan and
Mm,
Yemen, and now the war breaking out between Pakistan and Afghanistan. There are other things at play that
mm,
um, I think that the rhetoric around the peace of this kind of public display of power of certain centers of power and the marginalization of others is both a distraction as well as a kind of forewarning to what
yeah.
comes next. So
Mm,
it certainly cuts the ability of any European independent European voice. I think the Spanish, who had some kind of public accountings for and try to somehow steer, at least for their constituency, which is very almost violently supportive of intervening to stop this mass murder in
yeah.
Gaza. The fact that political group in Spain, out of political expediency or whatever, had to take certain stances and positions vis-a-vis Spain's relationship with Israel. We forget the massive activism inside Italy itself. The unions
Yeah.
really started finally to blocking
Yes.
trade, not only with Israel, but also upsetting, day-to-day life in Italy itself,
Mm,
which tells you just how quickly things can, where you will have interested parties responding to this. Kind of
mm,
reminds me of, the periods of Occupy Wall Street, where, they immediately started, well, once this gets up to a popular level where we can't control anymore, we need to take matters into it and take it into a different direction. So the Sharm el Sheikh events have actually speaks to a number of different things that are indirectly linked to the tactics, the strategies, and the end game in Gaza, which I still believe is going to be mass murder, expulsion. They're still using that. We're going to find a nice, safe home for them somewhere in the region. This is utterly destroyed. Looks like a nuclear bomb. They went a little bit too far, these Netanyahu types, which was also part of the evolving discourse about what was happening. Is that, again, these are outliers. Israel can be rehabilitated. It is not an evil society. It's not an evil project. It's just these marginal players who can be disciplined when necessary. And the narrative around what Trump did to facilitate this is that, he's twisting arms. It was a lot was made of his speech in the Knesset about who he was pointing fingers at and who was responsible for this, and whether or not you interpreted it as him distancing himself from it and kind of allowing for the public to debate about what he was saying, or if he's just playing, in many ways, the duplistic, corrupted politician who got billions of dollars circulating in ways that would service his family, his dynasty, his allies. I suspect it's a combination of both in some ways. Um, I think that his base needs to hear him being somewhat critical of the dynamics of American politics, which includes influence from outsiders. And it's a difficult task to be the main proponent for genocide, for ethnic cleansing, for stealing the lands and properties of not only of Palestinians, but potentially the Danes, right? This whole push towards taking over Greenland or going back to Bagram Air Base. This is kind of um, a, um, a precursor, I think, to other things that are going to be very much contradictory and clashing with the sensibilities of the normal American citizen, who are going to be facing some serious now um, expansion of state corporate power at their expense of their individual freedoms. They're going to experience austerity in ways that used to be only for third world countries. I think we're all going in that direction. So I think we're being set up somewhat. And we've proven to be regularly unsophisticated readers of this and jumping at the behest of certain voices who are telling us to celebrate this or feel somewhat relieved that oh, we have actually our flotilla has actually changed things on the ground. And no, Palestinians are still dying by the hundreds.
Definitely.
There is indeed a struggle now for trying to certainly address the corruption of some elements in Gazan society that have you always find these corrupted elements that betray their own people and betray any kind of meaningful cause that anyone could have. We know that Gazans have been divided for many years, however, about whether they embrace the PA, embrace an alternative to Hamas, maybe even more Islamic Jihad kind of elements, or I mean, I know plenty of Gazans who are now conveniently laying blame on Gaza, the events in Gaza to Hamas, which is, in my own interpretation of things, a little bit too extreme and unfamiliar with other power dynamics at play. Another thing that I find very interesting is that it also puts the onus front and center onto those auxiliaries who are standing quite sheepishly behind Trump. In some ways, especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, in these countries that are now, it's on them to finance, to bring security, reconstruction, bring security, and what is now circulating publicly, both UAE and Saudi Arabia in their own ways are saying, well, you have to disarm Hamas, right? This is the objective, that we need to disarm Hamas, or we're going to withdraw our support to the peace plan. So this all comes at a kind of potentially to a perfect storm to justify continued mass murder. I mean, Trump and his people had to somehow move away in the last couple of 48 hours or so from placing additional blame on Hamas for not cooperating, not providing the bones of the last remaining Israeli soldiers. At the expense of no one focusing on the horrors that the peoples coming back from Israeli torture centers have shared. And the fact that they have to actually say, well, you know what, this was a Israeli tank that drove over an ordinance and blew up, and so it's actually not Hamas that broke the ceasefire. I found that
it's interesting. They did
interesting game that the Trump people are playing, is that we're not actually entirely beholden to Netanyahu. We're not going to give him a blank check. Now, why they're doing that is something that requires, I think, a deeper conversation, but beyond what we're now observing, which is a sham on top of a sham, But it is telling us a lot about also the vulnerabilities, I think, of our enemies, our mutual enemies, that there's some points of pressure that they had to address by this exercise. Is it long term? No, I think we've dropped the gun here. I think all that mobilization that had led to solidarity throughout Europe, the strikes are over.
Mm-hmm.
People have gone back to their life. They have bought into the peace. I hear colleagues, oh, we have a peace plan now. Oh, we have a ceasefire. Isn't that what everyone was
Yeah,
asking
this is the
for?
problem. Yeah, this
Ceasefire.
is the
No,
problem.
you and I were saying, no, we don't want ceasefire. No, the entire relationship has to change between the world and
Mm-hmm.
Palestine. It's not just, you're giving us, some reprieve from violence that's going to happen again. We're not talking about ceasefire, but this is exactly the language that was pushed into the mouths of otherwise well-meaning people. And now that they got their ceasefire, as far as the media is concerned, I'm afraid that we've kind of let off the
Yeah.
momentum a little bit. And that's for me really tragic.
I think also it's another, you know, Israel has done this consistently and endlessly from 1948 onwards, right? These mythical ceasefires and peace deals, which never result in any justice or sovereignty for Palestine. And for me, this is just a form of psychological warfare because you give even the people of Gaza the belief in some kind of reprieve. In the last 48 hours, Netanyahu has still kept the Rafah border closed. There are no trucks entering. All of the Tom Fletcher drama of trucks entering Gaza is incorrect. They just went to an Israeli holding section. They haven't actually entered Gaza. Nothing is coming into Gaza, right? So for me, this is another form of psychological warfare. I think the bad cop, good cop routine between the Trump administration and Netanyahu is again an ongoing drama series. I don't put any faith in it at all. I think at some points politically Trump has to give himself some plausible deniability from his excessive complicity in genocide and in trying to basically facilitate the final solution for Netanyahu and to get Netanyahu off the hook politically and from his own corruption, prosecution, and so on, to give him a breather. On the positive side for Hamas, I do believe that the hostages were becoming a liability, and they were actually becoming a hindrance to Hamas operations. So I think for Hamas, it was actually a relief to be able to send out the 20 surviving hostages. The fact that Netanyahu is putting this unrealistic pressure on Hamas to find the dead when he and his Zionist Air Force have actually buried them under tons of rubble and then destroyed the capability of Hamas to excavate those bodies, of course. But this is normal. This is what we expect. Another thing that I wanted your opinion on, when Netanyahu so rapidly agrees to a ceasefire or some kind of fabricated peace deal, I always think it's in order also for Israel to recuperate in order to pivot somewhere else. So I'd also like to get your opinion on that because we saw that, of course, when they accepted so hurriedly the ceasefire with the Hezbollah back in November 2024. And almost immediately, what happened? The fall of Damascus through Israel's support of Jolani and the Takfiri militants in Syria.
And
So
Russia's complicity in this.
yeah, of course. We can come on to Russia in a minute because I think the subject of this pivot and just one other aspect as well, I think it's important for Saudi Arabia and for the Arab Zionist states, who of course were created by Britain in order to provide this kind of support for the Zionist entity in the Gulf. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia definitely at the head of that. But I think it's also important for Saudi Arabia, whose population still has a degree of resistance in the Hijaz, dating back to when the British allowed the Al Saud Wahhabi forces to overtake all of Saudi Arabia and take control. In the Hijaz, there are elements that are strongly opposed to the dissolution of any kind of Palestinian sovereignty. And so I think for Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel, they need this optic of peace. They need this get out of jail free card, which they can kind of go, oh, it's fine, then the genocide will finish. Now we can get on with trade and economy and normalizing with Israel. So I'd like to sort of get your take on both those. The fact that Israel may well now pivot elsewhere in the region, having kind of temporarily put Gaza on hold until they can come back and continue what they were doing in the first place. But of course, it's ramping up also in the West Bank at the same time.
Right. Well, certainly there was this strain on the apparatus of violence. We know that increasing numbers of foreigners were coming in to serve the role of brutalizing the people of Gaza. We know that some considerable assets from intelligence gathering to actually attacking Yemen has been moving up, and indeed a rather sad death of the commander and head of the Yemeni forces around Ansarallah. They finally reached him. In the meantime, I think there is, as you said, a need for reallocating resources for that pivot, wherever it will indeed come from, need to be directed. Certainly not Syria. Syria is no longer a threat. We know that in the long term, Turkey will and the United States, in some shape or form, will take the responsibility of dealing with any mess that comes from the continued violence in Syria itself, if that ever leads to an outbreak of resistance. Where Iran is involved, if that's what you're getting at, that somehow Israel is now gearing up to continuing its campaign against Iran in a direct confrontation. We will see. Again, I hear also from some of Trump's statements that he continuously humanizes Iranians in the last couple of weeks and says they're good people, and
that worries me though.
Yeah.
Because again, that's almost providing this plausible deniability that, Israel is the rogue state that will go in and attack. Or there's a potential for false flag. That's another potential.
Yeah, of course. That's always the warmongers always have that option to create a pretext for an undiscussed, undebated re-entry into war with any these days Muslim state, but it's also drug lords, right? So they're also attacking poor fishermen in the Caribbean, killing Trinidadians and Colombians and Venezuelans and Dominicans. What's that all about? That's also, I think, a larger kind of pretext for what is going to face all of us in Europe and the United States, a violence that's going to be really permissible by way of, you've allowed this to happen in other places. And we have the same kinds of forces that you have allowed the Trump administration to justify as not murder, but to protect the state. And now we need to do this to domestic enemies as well. And that will be, but again, that's a little bit of a distraction to our area of focus. And so, yeah, there certainly is. I got that sense just from being in the Balkans this week about, again, the war is over in Gaza for many people suddenly, which is really, really nerve-wracking and gut-wrenching to actually have to sit there and listen quietly and not get angry at people. At the same time, Israel is replenishing. It certainly gives those warmongers who began to be a little bit very, in public around the world, very defensive, very violently defensive. And it got to the point where they became really obnoxious. And I think that also affected the politics in many countries in Europe and the United States. How dare these people who are clearly advocating for the mass murder of brown people who live in their native lands, and now they're browbeating us and accusing all of us of being anti-Semitic for actually caring about this. So that I think will be nurtured a little bit in the kind of public discourse that's going to emerge. And so if indeed a new war with Iran will help facilitate the and repositioning Iran as the the besieged democracy for civilization, for Western civilization, the better this peace plan it serves that interest as well. You're right that they are steering their resources, but is it to fight and wage war? Is it to rehabilitate somewhat the narrative that Israel is in fact not is an innocent, just their motivations are. I mean, you see it in from their influencers. I see it a lot on X for the last couple of days. We too have children. We want to protect our children. We want to protect the homeland. We have nowhere else to go. So kind of a repeat of these last decades of justifications for their violence. But
Yeah.
I think that they recognized, or they had consultants telling them that you're losing a little bit with these personalities who have commandeered what Israel and what Zionism is, and they're not really pleasant to watch from outsiders who have no sympathy for such a regime, and therefore only feel coerced to keep quiet about this. So I think that yes, it's redirecting their energies while still doing the task of murdering and I mean they've by this so-called agreement, 55% of the land is now de facto annexed, right, with the yellow zone, right? So that was fairly without much contestation. The rest of the world embraced it. Even Spain, even Italy are going to not really give too much of raise too much legal issues about that. And then we just move forward. So if indeed violence explodes, I think Lebanon, where you are at, is seeing a new wave of particular specific kinds of attacks on infrastructure, on capacity, maybe also Hezbollah sites, some assassination attempts, but I think it's not arbitrary what they're doing in Lebanon. It is reflective of a long-term strategy that probably corresponds with the American embassy and their assets on the ground in Lebanon. In Iran itself, I'm not certain that we will see an air war. I think there was already, from what has been exposed, about that both Iranian and American officials shared their targets. They basically said that we're not going to really start a war that will go to the end, but we're going to basically come to this agreement that we're going to share each other's hit sites, and the Americans are even selling the story that, oh, we didn't know until the planes were in the air that they were going to attack the negotiators in Qatar, in Doha, which I think is BS, frankly.
It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, because the surveillance equipment that the US has there's absolutely no way that they didn't know when it happened and that they weren't aware in advance. And Qatar also, I think they were warned.
Oh, it was shameless. And then the giving the hug to the Israeli negotiation in Sharm el-Sheikh. But again, those are all things that have been made available. This is not some secret camera that caught something that nobody wanted to see. So I think at this stage, I mean, it's in the end a useless enterprise. But what else can we do? But to start to try to figure out what are they actually doing? What is the objective here? And I think it is a reflection of a little bit of nervousness that they could lose control of their audience if the violence continued in such an obnoxious, manipulative way. And now I think they've secured compliance. I think everybody that bought into this being peace are going to be disappointed, but they're going to be a little bit difficult for them to somehow ratchet up the anger towards one party anymore. It's going to be,
Yeah,
again, they're both
exactly.
complicit. They're both responsible for this, and that's they've done this in different war settings in the past,
Mm,
where they've been effectively been able to sell that everyone in this war is responsible.
mm,
And I think that's what I'm concerned about, is that the people of Gaza have lost their ability to actually stand on the bones of their loved ones and say, you know what, we need your help if we're going to have this end. And it's going to be difficult for Gazans to gain that kind of support for the next 6 months or so. And that's where we're going to really start seeing the end project
mm.
take place, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I think how they've managed it sort of in the media and with this these theatrics is they've almost put Hamas in a position of they didn't accept all the points of the peace deal, but they accepted the ceasefire, but it's sold as the peace deal. So
Mhm.
now when we come to the point where, of course, Hamas is not going to disarm, why would they accept amnesty or deportation with guarantees when they've seen Hamas bombed in Qatar or assassinated in Tehran, like Ismail Haniyeh? Um, so I think that's when we reach the point of it's all gonna kick off again, in my opinion. And for me, the end game is Gaza will become a free trade zone, as was, this peace plan is no different to all the previous peace plans since October the 7th. It's just slightly repackaged, and Tony Blair comes to the surface as the war criminal shit he is, basically. And but ultimately the plan hasn't changed from the Zionist bloc perspective, and that includes the Gulf states. And for me, it's almost pushing towards with the ethnic cleansing of minorities in Syria and the entire region, including the Christian communities from the entire region, really. But in Syria, particularly, and in Lebanon, of course, the Christian factions that you have there, the majority are pro-Israel. There are some very strong pro-resistance factions even within the Christian communities here, but they're in the minority. Is we're almost heading for this, what I see as a final war, a Kabbalah II, where you have the followers of the Wahhabi doctrine against the resistance doctrine, which is, of course, Shia Islam and also normal Sunni Muslims who reject the Takfiri fanaticism that, of course, has been facilitated and sponsored by the West for decades. That's what I see coming eventually. And for Israel, it requires total dominance and protection in the region. And that's where the danger comes in, because in my opinion, even countries like Egypt and Jordan and even Saudi Arabia in the future are in danger or at risk of not being able to develop any kind of offensive or defensive capability. That's why Trump is, holding back on providing Saudi Arabia with any kind of real assurances. And that's slightly, I've dovetailed a bit, but that brings me on also to much is being made of the Saudi Pakistan security deal. And the fact that Saudi Arabia now brings itself under the Pakistani nuclear umbrella, and that Pakistan is effectively an ally of China. So Saudi Arabia is looking for an alternative to the US for its future security assurances. Could you comment? I mean, I'm very skeptical of it, let's put it that way, but I'd like to kind of get your take on it.
Well, if indeed that's the conclusion people make, then I'm afraid they're wrong. It's wishful thinking that there is such a deep divide between a regime
Mm,
that has, especially under Mohammed bin Salman's watch, going full throttle towards trying to stave off financial collapse.
yeah,
We already know that there are big mega projects which are marketed,
yeah. Neom
and
City and yeah,
Neom City doesn't exist, and it's not going
yeah.
to happen. And now they've proposed such a thing for Mecca, Medina, which has
Yes.
gotten maybe 3 days of attention. And then they had the Cube in Riyadh, which also seems to have now been forgotten. So this is a regime that is desperately trying to remain relevant. And I think that they're partners of the past. The Anglo-Saxon empire are desperate
Mm.
to keep a kind of Zionist version in the Islamic world at play, kind of like the evangelical Christian one that we have in the Western world, right? So it, it it disrupts kind of traditional ways of mediating conflict between one's own people. It creates this schism of and dyslexia, if you will, about what are our principles when you have supposedly people being heralded as the quintessential Muslim state, completely offering contradictory messages, and then having belly dancing, on the streets and Jennifer
Yeah.
Lopez, visiting on occasion to perform for the kinds of I mean, nothing against young people wanting to enjoy themselves, but this is the kind of exaggerated move to which caters to a kind of a global kind of scene, if you will, that's um, to me alerts me to desperation. And this is where I found it, and I mentioned this to you before, I found it very disheartening that as a strategy, the resistance did not spend more of its resources and capacities to actually undermine the framework of empire in the Middle East, which is to go after
Mm.
the pillars.
Yeah.
Maybe not directly at the Zionist state, but the vulnerability of the other aspects of this
Hmm.
structure, especially in the Gulf, I think would have been over the long term, in retrospect, a much better use of the bravery of those who are resisting. Um, uh, so where this Pakistan agreement does, I mean, what has Pakistan done in the past but provide manpower for all these regimes, right? I mean, this is just a kind of a, a a new iteration of an old relationship. Pakistan provided the poor men to go and stand in front of the border and protect these otherwise unprotectable regimes, both from their own people and from their neighbors. So I don't see that as a serious diversion from the past 100 years relationship that the British Empire helped lay the foundations to, and the Americans have taken on and expanded with a vengeance, right? With the
Mm.
mobilization of political Islam to service empire's violent needs in many parts of the world. The fact that Pakistan itself has been occasionally funding and aiding incursions into Iran via
Yeah.
Baluchistan, the fact that they have this hostile relationship over Kashmir with India, they had this brief war. That's somewhat of a interesting deviation from my understanding of how all of these regimes play, what role they play in the larger frame of the
Mm.
world shifting towards concentration of power that we've never seen before in the hands of much smaller groups of parties. This war with Afghanistan certainly has its historic roots that sometimes don't even need to be registered in circles of power in the North Atlantic, but it's certainly being used.
Yeah.
It's not by mistake that it's actually coming on the back of claims by that maybe there needs to be a reinvestment in American presence in Afghanistan on the pretext that China and others are having too much influence. The scramble for rare earths and all these other things are part of the equation, which I doubt,
Mm.
considering much of the industrial capacity remains in China for everything that makes the global economy roll. So any way to expedite and facilitate the move of these required minerals to the factories of China, it makes economic sense for everyone who is invested in the global economy.
Yeah.
Um, so if there is an overlying impression that this is all contested, then it makes for it easier to justify the kinds of resources put into getting access to these areas that have
Mm.
untouched, untapped resources of lithium or the rare earths, cobalt and others. So, and in the meantime, things in Sudan are getting yet again worse, even though there seemed to have been a correction somewhat. Turkey is always an important element that's often left out of these equations.
Yeah.
And I think the internal rivalries that are at play that could possibly disrupt any of this is I think, serious animus between Qataris and their tools, if you will, of influence, which really do terrorize Abu Dhabi and to an extent also Saudi Arabia. I've always seen it as there's not enough room for three major allies. I think there's going to be consolidation at some point of the territories and the resources, and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula can go to hell. There's no oil and gas in many of these places, and until that's resolved, I think there's going to be a struggle between these rival families over who's going to actually survive this transition. And you can see that played itself out, and clearly there's a division between UAE and Saudi Arabia on one side, and Qatar, even in this so-called peace, this ceasefire dynamic around Gaza, let alone what's happening in Syria and elsewhere.
I was just going to say, I think you can see it most clearly in Syria, where Qatar is very much aligned with Turkey, as it always was from a Muslim Brotherhood, political Islam perspective. And UAE and Saudi Arabia are very much aligned in Syria. And that has always been the case, to be honest.
And this is, if you look at
sorry,
Libya, if you look at Sudan, if you look at Yemen, those divisions manifest in very violent form on the ground in those places as well.
I also wanted just to ask what you think, because obviously Turkey, Israel, and the US have been vying for influence in Azerbaijan and Armenia, and over the Zangezur corridor, which of course is a direct threat, not only to Iran, but also potentially to Russia, because it borders the North Caucasus. It potentially puts a spanner in the wheel of the North-South trade corridor that Russia is trying to formalize with Iran. And that could also be why now there's this pivot suddenly to Afghanistan, because Russia is trying to reinstate itself very much in Afghanistan to ensure an alternative route to the Zangezur or the Armenia-Azerbaijan area for the North-South trade corridor. So I think these trade corridors play an incredibly important part in these maneuvers, in my opinion. And that brings me on sort of quite neatly onto the Russia-Iran strategic partnership, let's say. I mean, I have my opinion about how Iran views it, having spoken to a number of Iranian resistance-focused people here. But I'd be really interested in yours, because a lot of people say to me, I'm trying to break through this idea that one thing that Russia will never abandon in this region is the existence of Israel. That's it. That's their red line. And as long as people understand that, then they can appreciate what Russia is doing. It can't do what it's doing in Syria right now, which is to expand and consolidate on its influence in Syria without Israel. It's impossible. Nobody else would have lobbied Trump and Washington for Russia to not only remain in Syria, but actually to expand, basically, further beyond what it had under President Assad. But with Russia and Iran, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people are talking about this dialogue that went on during the 12-day war, where Russia was saying they offered help, but Iran refused, and officials in Iran, both military and political, were saying Russia didn't do enough. So I guess I just want to get your point of view, also looking, I guess, at the historical animosity between Russia and Iran, as to what people should expect from this strategic partnership that has no mutual defense pact, unlike with North Korea, of course.
Well, I think you've already highlighted some of the contradictions
Yeah.
coming from Iranian perspective. I mean, there's the kind of a public statements, and then there are those who are actually saying on the ground, we don't trust Russians at all. And that's been manifest for years in some ways.
Mm.
I mean, you don't let Russian officials get too deeply insinuated into decision-making circles. Unfortunately, those have been infiltrated in other ways, and many of them have been targeted and killed by Israeli forces or other kind of professional murderers out there. My suspicion is that there's elements within the very rapidly shifting political class in conjunction with economic interests inside Iran who are moving Iran very rapidly away from the revolution and slowly weeding out the most influential and members of the old guard, if you will, of the Revolutionary Guard and others, abandoning Syria, abandoning Hezbollah, perhaps, availing prizes like opening up opportunities for assassinations inside Iran in return for the eventual rehabilitation and the windfall that will come from it, right? The moment that this vibrant economy, largely operating independently for decades, with its most brilliant young people who haven't left, taken the education they got, and then gone to the West to become professors and well-paid professionals in various industries. It's one of the sad stories about our resistance that the resistance has produced such brilliant people, but many of them, I mean, one can understand why you want for your family on the long term material security. Do they have it? Probably not, considering what's happening now to the Western economies and the racism that still exists and the Islamophobia that forces people to contort themselves in all kinds of ways around the world. But I take as the nervousness about any public round of reflections that there could be an alliance moving forward between the Russians and whatever is happening to the political class in Iran. I think a justified nervousness and a mistrust, which I think is also earned by the Russians. They have regularly demonstrated, even in the Cold War, by the way, that they are able to turn on a dime. That whole enterprise of the Soviet Union suddenly became very reactionary and very hostile to certain groups of Marxist activists around the world because of these stupid ideological kind of transformations inside the party itself. Obviously, Russia before the revolution was also, in Iran's eyes, an occupying power that had always coveted Iranian lands and played an
In the
important
north,
played an important part in that horrible starvation of the World War I, where upwards of 7 million Iranians starved to death as the British and the Russians, fighting a common war against the Ottomans, used Iran as its source of food and immiserated the population. And then, of course, the iconic meetings in Tehran in 44, where the world was divided up between especially the British and the Soviets, at least Europe and Europe and the Middle East was. So there's a long history to be suspicious of their neighbors to the north. For those who are the liberals, if you will, who are hoping for a rehabilitation and reintegration in a formal way. I mean, Iran is part of the global economy. Its resources are flowing out. They're just being bought for much less than they're worth, which is also something to keep in the back of our minds. This warbling that comes, they come often at a considerable savings for those who consume them in the ultimate end. And there's lots of profit to be made from smuggled or illegally circulating oil, gas, and other things. So I'm pretty sure the Bazaris, who have long threatened the revolution from their patronizing elements in the 1980s already to regularly making overtures to capitalists out in the outside world, that I think they can find a useful, whether it be Russian or Chinese, combination of those two, and or the entire world. That's again the theater seemed to have turned their back on improving relations with this last kind of UN kind of demand being and punishment being reenacted, right? Further
Yeah,
isolation.
yeah.
So again, to me, I read that as windows of opportunity to make more money for those who are already entrenched in this economy that has been built around breaking through Iran's isolation. So that doesn't necessarily break anyone's heart who have been making money off of this in the past. Again, were these wars that Iran fought or battles or whatever they were against Israel in the last couple of iterations of them, were they actual threats or were they helping to consolidate the power of certain elements in Iranian society against others? I don't think the old Revolutionary Guard got empowered by, even though Iranians themselves responded with patriotism,
Yeah.
especially this last 12 days or so. It's that momentum also seems to have kind of faded away as new factors come into play. And as I was reminded in my just came back from the Balkans, this winter will be very crucial for many of us in the Northern Hemisphere in terms of what are the kind of burdens in paying for our heating and paying for our food. And I mean, are we going to get hit really bad by this austerity that is already manifesting itself? But it could be when you start paying for, especially in Europe and other parts where does not circulate freely or cheaply as it used to, and it's coming now from more monopolistic elements that are overpricing for the same service. Speaking of American LNG or Qatari LNG
Yeah.
and things like that, what will happen to these still very fragile political orders that we have in many parts of the region and those areas surrounding the region, whose own stability depends a lot on what happens in Iran and in the Caucasus, in Turkey. So that's something I can alert your audience to that's maybe a little bit different from what they are generally hearing in our commonly shared sources of debate and news.
Yeah.
So I don't believe Russia is there to save anyone's ass, frankly. They're there to encumber any resistance and are
Yeah.
contributing to the further decimation of capacity for resistance against empire, sadly.
Well, I think you made a very important point there, whereas I think cynically looking at it, China and Russia benefit from the maintenance of weakness among the resistance. And ultimately, they also benefit from the dominance of the Arab Gulf states. And that means of the entire Zionist bloc, which of course can't be separated from Western power structure also. So I think, you know, when you look at it from a national interest perspective, it's not in Russia's interest to actually ensure the supremacy of the resistance in any way, shape, or form, or the success, not even supremacy, the success of the resistance. And I guess internally in Iran, yes, I think since well, actually, if you go back to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, which is another inspirational leader that I had the absolute privilege to meet with a press delegation in 2017. Amazing guy. He was an architect and an engineer. I mean, you know, these guys were absolute visionaries for the future of the region, and they were taken out for that reason. Same with Syed Hassan Nasrallah. You know, people are very unaware of how important these people were to the people of Lebanon, the people of Syria, the people of Yemen, the people of Iraq. They were literally what held the fabric of society together, and that's why they've been murdered, as you said, assassinated. And Trump has been responsible for much of that. I mean, he lured Soleimani and Mohandas to a diplomatic mission in Baghdad with Saudi Arabia. He lured Hamas to Qatar for peace negotiations. You know, these are constant traps set for the resistance. And I agree with you on within Iran, which is a vast country with huge, I mean, Syria is a diverse country, or was a diverse country. Now it's being plunged into sectarian fracture and eventual federalization. And Russia is playing a huge part in that, of course. So as I said, I don't think it's in the interest of Russia and China for these countries to become resistance oriented, because this will create a massive divide for them to manage in the economic world. I don't know if you agree with that, but when I look at it from a sort of aerial view, that's what I see. I have one question for you, which is, it's something that's really puzzling me because I just don't understand why he would do that. Why did Putin have the telephone conversation with Netanyahu and then inform Iran that there was going to be no war against Iran, that Israel didn't want? From a diplomatic optic perspective, and then combine it with him and his pageant of Al-Qaeda at the Kremlin, I don't quite get how he can take such a massive misstep in the optics of how Russia is going to be perceived in West Asia and even beyond, even in Venezuela, for example, who perceive this as a to a large degree a betrayal of the values of the resistance and the anti-imperialist ideology. So I'd just finally be really interested on your take on that.
Is it time to show your actual cards, your hand? I mean, if to use a metaphor in Porco, is it decided that it's no longer necessary to play that role of possible ally in this reconfiguration? The consequences of yet again not standing up on behalf of your partners in Venezuela or elsewhere that are now going to be slowly regime changed, as the Americans like to call it. That could have over the long term more cost than simply just demonstrating, like, you know, you shouldn't have listened to us anyway. We're adapting, and we're just going to now. The realities on the ground are we're going to do business with the people who killed our soldiers, beheaded our soldiers. I mean, could you imagine? Let alone destroyed a beautiful country like Syria and did such things
and
elsewhere.
are still destroying, still murdering, still
Still
massacring, still
But
shedding the blood
we'll
of
do business
Syrians.
with them. We'll stay out of it. We're not going to get involved. Maybe we'll even give you some technological support to do even more of it, right? I mean, we did it in Chechnya, so why not? You know, let's continue.
Well, potentially arm them to attack Lebanon and Iraq, of course. That's
so
the eventual plan.
Yeah, so the optics are, yeah, it seems to be a discord with what at least many outsiders were trying to use the idea, the notion that Russia is somehow clean of all these little dubious political games, or in fact a member of BRICS and an alternative. The wishful thinking of so many in the West. Maybe that's really what was the cause of our disappointment, as opposed to actual listening to and looking at what Russia was really all about. Because you and I, were always very frustrated with this partnership that really started to implant itself in 2015 and onwards. It had the feel of kind of restraining Syrians from actually 100%. Developing a viable long-term survival strategy, constantly being bombarded with no assistance whatsoever, no consequences from Israel, and the constant incursions of Turkish sourced violence never addressed by the patron of Syria. So Yeah, maybe I think we have been we are only I'm not I myself have long been suspicious of this oligarch-led Russian economy and its relationship to empire in sometimes unclear ways. But if any regime embraces Israel so so emphatically, then that should immediately
Mm,
discount their legitimacy in anything else. There's no way that China
exactly.
can be in partnership with Israel like this, and that we
Hmm.
can somehow see China as being somehow a liberating force moving forward. People have
Yeah,
to really start thinking in those terms. You can't be so contradictory. You can't be so duplistic.
yeah.
You can't have your values so divided and and give them a buy in one context in the hope that they're going to actually prove to be reliable elsewhere. So sadly for the peoples of our region that we live in and love so much, the peoples who would indeed have, if they were to secure by way of resistance some independence, some autonomy,
Yeah.
what would their economic principles be based on? Would certainly be more nationalistic. They certainly wouldn't
Yes.
allow Russian and Chinese capital to
Look
gobble.
at Hezbollah. Look at the
Yeah,
banking system
yeah,
that they're trying to destroy from Hezbollah, which is based on no usury. I mean, this,
yes,
of course, they don't want this to flourish. The
of
same
course.
in Yemen, the same in
Yes,
any
yeah.
genuine Islamic
Mhm.
society. You
So,
know,
so we have to be a little bit more,
yeah,
go to several layers to understand and appreciate
yeah.
why these guys in Shanghai or in Moscow actually would not want to see the end positive end result of what we are envisioning, when we
Yeah.
support and stand by resistance to empire.
Mm.
So,
I actually just one last question, because
mm,
what I often get thrown at me when I have this discussion by those that are very pro BRICS, pro this being an alternative paradigm to the imperialist West, colonialist West, is that, well, what can you expect China and Russia to do? You know, the West created this um, scenario, they created the world we live in. So how can China and Russia break out of the world that we live in? So for me, this is just saying, well, there isn't going to be any change because the dominant scenario has already been created, and China and Russia are just vying for power within that dominant paradigm, right?
so yeah, well, so why don't people in Ansar Allah or Hezbollah just capitulate? I'm sure the leader
Exactly.
would have been rewarded with a nice hotel
Oh,
rooms
of course.
and vacations in Marbella, as their ancestors in neighboring countries clearly capitulated a long time ago. But in the end, did the people who did capitulate and who have embraced loyally the New World Order since the early 20th century, have they really benefited from that? No.
Hmm.
And again, maybe the very powerful in Shanghai and Moscow and elsewhere will be able to separate themselves from the misery that awaits everybody in the
Hmm.
world as we're going towards this direction. But that's pretty damn cynical, isn't it? To think of yourself as
Yeah.
immune to what's going to happen to the rest of humanity. That's not resistance. That's not revolution.
Yeah.
And
And
it's
and
clear.
that's always my point. It's
Yeah.
always at the expense of the genuine freedom ideology,
Yeah.
the genuine people who want to create a better system for humanity to exist within. And you know,
And we
that's
can't,
what people
yeah.
don't understand sometimes.
And those of us in the West, you can't freeload. You can't just, hope that something they do well and they actually miraculously survive. It's
Mm,
also, we feed into the system. We're paying taxes. We legitimize this mechanism of exploitation, of wealth
mhm,
extraction. And soon enough, the vast majority of the people in the West are also going to realize that once again, they're going to realize maybe it's too late even for them to even consciously realize this, but they are just simple digits in this kind of way of looking at the world. And they should have happened yesterday already. Should have taken up arms and should have taken up and stand up on principle, not only for those people who are being brutalized now, but who are being brutalized in very more subtle ways, psychologically, physically, materially. And that happens with everyone in the West. And they're all going to get this visited upon them soon enough. I mean, Europe has been fighting bloody wars against brothers and sisters, colleagues, and members of the same unions for 200, 300 years. We haven't learned yet. And we somehow buy into this idea that things have changed for Europeans and that somehow this right of peace could somehow be extended to the rest of the world. That's not that is not what delivers peace. Our security is subsidized by this mechanism stealing and robbing from others. And it's a blood-drenched middle-class lifestyle that is not going to go away as well in the West.
Yeah. Even if you look at, I mean, it's the rare earth mineral monopoly that China has that is often celebrated by people who support China as being their ideological war against the West. But if you actually look at what that monopoly on both the mining and the processing is doing to the environment for some of the poorest countries in the world and the communities in those countries in the world, whether it's Mongolia or Vietnam or Africa, should we be celebrating that? Particularly when rare earth minerals, what are they going into? The very things that are going to enslave us for the future, whether it's flat screen TVs, smartphones, weapons, everything, that entire digital prison is being created out of the rare earth minerals that is at the same time destroying our beautiful planet to an untenable degree. So, I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this just as much as other people at times, we don't look at things in the right way. In what future do we want for our kids, for our grandkids? I mean, I don't have any, but I know you have kids. What future do we want for them? What future do we want for the people of this region that have suffered centuries of persecution and misery and deprivation, disenfranchisement, so on, and genocide, basically. And we have to make a choice.
Yes, I wholeheartedly embrace and stand behind what you're saying and what needs to be done, what should have been done a long time ago. But again, I think it's going to be increasingly more difficult moving forward to do that, accomplish that, unless there's really full-scale a change of attitude that we have with our world. And it's not from this curated environmentalism that focuses on carbon credits and things like that, but a real kind of principled collective resistance to how we live.
And retaining what it is that makes us human, because we're in danger of being pushed to the point where we abandon a degree of our humanity, our compassion, our everything that I've seen the change even in British society from when I lived there, which was more than 25 years ago, to now. It's scary. So that's only in 25 years.
Yeah.
But what can we do? We can only keep talking and supporting not only the movements that are actually doing something objectively and constructively to create a better environment for humanity, but also to become a part of that movement ourselves, as you said, actively in any way that we can.
Yeah, and one doesn't want to advocate on air, at least, certain actions, but just be, historically, some very brave minority in any society, and again, these are minorities in their society, but they are surrounded by people who, with the right combination of factors, could actually be directly involved in support, if those conditions change just enough. So there are a lot of potential allies and auxiliaries for the resistance. And morally, I think there still is outrage and disgust with how power has been concentrated in the hands of the most corrupt, and how that power is protected and preserved by violence. I think that people still are outraged by that, even in places like the United States. It's just that what are their outlets? And it becomes easily steered into cartoonish kind of moments, and people get increasingly frustrated. But in the meantime, they get, because of our media, increasingly isolated, and they can't communicate with each other. There's no less communicative society than the United States. People are so broken up by their geographies, by their class differences, by
Yep.
the immediacy, the lack of immediacy in the way they conduct their lives. But I know from my experiences many years ago traveling in that country is that there are a lot of those people who are just on the edge of actually becoming active members of resistance. And so that's even in the United States. Throughout the world, that ability to start to embrace resistance, unfortunately, gets confused by all the alternatives, the confusing insinuations of
Like the Kurds.
claimants to
Because
actually.
yeah.
And so many people resort to simply going into a Hollywood world where it's the Avenger, these kind of DC comic characters. And so fast they are starving for a hero, and that's why BRICS, I think, in some weird way, even amongst very intelligent, educated people, can overwhelm them and actually serve as a viable option, where in fact it never was. And but yeah, Vanessa, it's we always end with a low note. I know you always bring it up at the very end with something positive to say, so I'm not very capable of doing that.
Well, I think I think there is a growing awareness in the West. I mean, I see it just through people online, people who watch, for example, UK Column News. I know you did an interview with Mike Robinson that I think is going to be published on Thursday for people to be aware of also. I do think there is a growing awareness. I think actually, from my opinion, there needs to be more direct conversations. YouTube's a great platform. All of these social media platforms are great, but nothing does it better than actually having people in front of you that you're talking to and conversing with, and that you continue speaking with even after the event. You can actually then create a real change in the thinking, the perceptions, and so on. And so I know UK Column is trying to do more and more of that. And we would love you to obviously be involved in any events. I'm trying to steer them towards Europe because it's not that easy for me to go back to the UK now. So Europe would be a lot better. And I think even doing something in Lebanon, I think would be a really good idea to sort of bring academics and journalists and so on together, both regional and external, and actually face-to-face sit down and talk about the options and plans, strategy, tactics, and so on. Because I think what is really important for me is that people recognize this is one war, one people, against those in the predator class that are trying to subjugate all of us in whatever region we're in. And that for me is the most important thing for people to really grasp and also feel. So by coming here, for example, and meeting people that think in the same way, that actually uphold the community values and the moral values, the human values that they also hold dear, I think then they recognize that connection. So I don't know, going forward, perhaps that's something that we should all be working on to try and create that coalescence of ideas and philosophy and movements.
Absolutely. That's, if we all kept to our communities and kept loyal to each other and protected our neighbors and protect our loved ones, we wouldn't be in this situation that we're in
Exactly.
now. So something happened a couple of 100 years ago that steered us into this direction of global scale violence against peoples
Yeah.
who had nothing to do with anything that was involved the city of London or Wall Street, but that was only possible to happen when we started to no longer
Yeah.
live in self-contained communities.
Mm.
And we obviously are not going to be able to do that in the short and medium term, but that's something for us to actually think about doing in the future. Not live under one government, one world government. That is not the objective. Have to go back to self-governance, regional autonomy, find ability to feed ourselves, and maybe give up that idea that we can go and get on buses and planes and travel the world and just live with taking pictures of ourselves in all places while we are served by poor
Yeah.
people everywhere. That's kind of the arrogance of our momentary privilege from one corner of the world or another. And so I fully embrace the idea of us meeting people, like-minded people, talking, but then also going back to from wherever we come and actually create little circles. I mean, very
Yeah,
modest, but
exactly.
think about if cumulatively, if we're millions of small communities are created, that makes it basically impossible for the octopus
Yeah,
to consume us.
exactly. And
Yeah.
communities that are connected, not isolated, because at the moment, most of the communities that are doing so are isolated effectively. Right. So yeah, I think that's a very important future, well, near future strategy. Isa, thank you so much again for your time. I always really appreciate talking to you and discussing what's going on. And as I said before, I'd appreciate doing it regularly if you have the time.
Yes, I